welcome to Counterpunch Radio. My name is Eric Draitzer. Thanks so much for tuning in, coming back to the show. First time listeners finding the show, welcome aboard. Always happy to have you. Hope you've all gone over to Counterpunch Plus, gotten your subscriptions. That's how you can support this project, how you can show your love for independent media. I know that things sometimes seem bleak. By the time you're listening to this, it's probably already been the US election, so it may seem a whole lot bleaker. But in the meantime, remind yourself that one of the ways that we resist is by supporting these spaces that we have on the left for this kind of media. Counterpunch is always, always appreciative of all of your support. Go over to the website. The fund drive has been a blast. It continues to be a blast. It's always a joy to ask for money and to panhandle in the way that we must. But here we are. And so go over to Counterpunch and do that thing. Speaking of independent journalists that we love and support, I am very happy to welcome back one of them, one who we've had here on the show several times. When we talk about Brazil, I always want to talk to Michael Fox. Michael Fox is a wonderful journalist. He's a multimedia journalist. He's the host of an excellent podcast that you all need to subscribe to wherever it is you get your podcast. It's called Brazil on Fire. He's on Twitter at mfox_US. Michael Fox, welcome back to Counterpunch.
Thanks so much, Eric. Pleasure to be here.
So, Mike, I heard some things of pretty large significance have been happening in Brazil. I
Oh
hear
yeah.
rumors that an election happened. So, anyway, tell us the
Oh yeah.
latest. What's going on? Yes, what's going on in Brazil? Pretty big news.
Luis Ignacio Lula da Silva, former president, is now the president-elect. But by now, most of your listeners already know that. But if they don't, this is like the working class hero, the man who fought the dictatorship at the end of the 1970s, led some of the largest union rallies there, that closed out the dictatorship, founded the Workers' Party, ran for the presidency, I don't even know how many times, and finally won in 2003, lifted millions of people out of poverty, left his second term with an approval rating of 87% in 2010, and then had to battle this massive an anti-corruption scheme in which they said he had um, received a beachside apartment from a company seeking government contracts, which was completely made up, and was jailed for 580 days. And now he's back. The Supreme Court overturned the decision a while ago and tossed everything out. It was all by a biased judge, and he has just won the presidency. It's just huge. So that's the main thing. Sorry for that long rollout, but that is Luis Ignacio Lula da Silva. He's the working class hero. Now, he won. He won by 2 million votes, so just under 2%. So it was a very close election. And what we've seen this week, the big concern was, will far right current President Jair Bolsonaro accept the results? And he came out and finally spoke. He was silent for 48 hours while his people protested and blocked roads in the streets, and he finally came out and actually said very little. But the most important thing was the fact that his chief of staff came on right after he spoke and said, "I have been authorized by Bolsonaro to begin the transition to the next government." So that was like Bolsonaro doesn't want to say he's going to accept the results, but he's doing it. And I'm here to say, all right, let's get it on. Um, and then what we saw yesterday were Bolsonaro's people actually protesting and rallying in front of military barracks, calling on the military to come out and try and overturn the results, try and stop the results. I mean, this is all digs into this whole like evangelical deep connection to the dictatorship, deep connection to the military, deep connection to fake news and disinformation, which is what Bolsonaro's entire campaign was about, and the faith that these people have that the military is actually going to come out and overturn, which is just not going to happen. But Bolsonaro supporters, feel that way. And in fact, what Bolsonaro finally came out today and said, listen, just stop blocking the roads, please. It's not good. It's not good for the Constitution. It doesn't really help what we're trying to do. So we'll see what happens there. But long story short, Lula will be inaugurated on January 1st. It's still probably going to be a tumultuous couple of months. And that's where we stand.
All right, a lot to say about all of that. First of all, um, What exactly does the transition entail here? I mean, we're familiar with what it means in the context of a US presidential administration and the transition from one to the next. I mean, is it something similar to that, or is there some kind of legal framework upon which they can rely constitutionally? What are the obligations of Bolsonaro? What might Bolsonaro's people do during the transition? What are their options? What can they do?
These are great questions, and we don't really have a very clear understanding about where everything lies now. But it's very similar to the United States. The transition, they were supposed to have met a first meeting with Geraldo Alckmin, who is Lula's vice president. He is um, interesting because Lula's whole campaign was about being it was about unity and democracy and about bringing all these different people together. And Alckmin is actually a Lula's former arch enemy. So Lula ran against him in 2006 and won, of course. But it's interesting that like this is Lula was trying to bring together a coalition of the democratic of the center left and even in Alckmin's case, center right parties, and to try and defeat Bolsonaro, and that's where he's got. So Alckmin was supposed to have met with Bolsonaro's transition team today to begin the process. It's very similar to the United States. I mean, you've got 2 months. Will be inaugurated on January 1st, and there's a lot of things to do between those times in order to get things up to speed. Um, it's hard to say exactly what Bolsonaro may or may not try and do in the next little bit. He's already rolled out and been spending funds at a breakneck speed in order to win these elections, funneling funds through what's known as a secret budget, which he himself authorized back in 2019 through Congress, where billions of rice and billions of US dollars would be moved into kind of pet projects for uh, aligned congressmen, and without any understanding about where they were going and whatnot. And Bolsonaro was spending just billions and billions of US dollars in this campaign to lower the price of gasoline, to give people their low income folks their monthly stipend ahead of time, to offer credits and loans, to really try and just shore up any sorts of votes for the working class as possible by kind of buying people off as best as possible. And so he has spent a ton of money. So that'll be a challenge for Lula just going forward. Where does Lula stand with kind of like the amount of money that Bolsonaro spent that's not on his ticket, but been spending money it's taken from other things or taken from next year and stuff. Um, but that's where things line. Now, Bolsonaro supporters, speaking about transition in this moment of the next few months, they are. I've been over the last month. I've been in 6 different states. I've been interviewing hundreds of people, and I've spoken with a lot of Bolsonaro supporters. And almost everyone I spoke with said, "Look, we marched on September 7th. Remember, that was Brazil's bicentennial Independence Day, and it was an event that Bolsonaro transformed into his like massive campaign rally. And so his people kind of got out en masse that day. And so a lot of people I spoke said, look, we got into the streets. We know how many people we are. We are obviously the majority. And if we lose, there's a problem with the elections. Like that was their level of like, democratic analysis of like, well, we lose. So that's where they're feeling right now. Well, either something happened or, God, who was supposed to give us the presidency, didn't. So why not? Because that's been Bolsonaro's whole campaign has been run on this faith, holy war, good versus evil messaging. Um, so it is very likely that they will continue to be obstructive in the coming months, and obviously obstructive during Lula's government, very much like Trump people, and Trump supporters in the U.S. But I think the big thing, Eric, the major fears about the fraud claims, the major fears about a January 6th moment. I don't think that we're going to see that at this point. I think like Bolsonaro didn't speak the first 48 hours trying to figure out what he was going to do. And I think he wanted to save faith. And that's why he didn't say very much. He didn't want to tell his supporters like, oh, sorry, we lost. Like he's like Trump like that. He's not going to admit failure and defeat. Um, and although folks might get in the streets and they might continue to protest and whatever else, like the elites are very much now they've kind of transitioned toward Lula. We just saw one of the most important televangelist pastors saying that it's clear that since Lula won the election, God has forgiven Lula and that we have to get on board. And that was huge because he was all on board with Bolsonaro. This type of politicking, or the centrist people or the elites kind of getting on board with whoever's the presidency, is something very common in Brazil, and it's something that we're seeing now. At the same time, as almost 100 countries have already recognized the results and are on board with the Lula government. So I think we're now at a point that the momentum is obviously at Lula's back. He clearly won the elections. They were clearly not fraudulent, despite everything that Steve Bannon tries to say. And I think that's the direction we're headed. And people are, obviously, the majority of the population, and obviously Lula supporters, are so excited for the possibility of change.
Well, you already teased Steve Bannon, so we'll talk about that in a minute. But before we do, just tell us a little bit about what the rest of the political landscape looks like for Lula. What is the legislature that he's going to have to deal with? How strong is the right wing as it relates to regional governments, as it relates to its, I guess you could say, balance of power relative to the Workers' Party? Where does that all stand?
Well, Bolsonaro did very, very well these elections. If you remember back 2 years ago during the municipal elections, he was a man who local candidates didn't even want his name on their ticket. Like, they didn't want anything to do with him. And that was around like in the middle of like COVID, was like kicking off, and like he was just tainted everything. But he really swooped in, and was able to elect 99 members of his Liberal Party into Congress. Uh, More other right wing parties also did very well. Many of his governors also did very well. So he did very well in this election. What was interesting is that it seemed like a campaign tactic where he took many of his ex ministers in power, including, for instance, um, his former Minister of Human Rights and Family, Damaris Alves, who was this evangelical pastor, his former Minister of the Environment, Salles, former Minister of Justice, Sergio Moro, right, who was the man who actually jailed Lula, and they all won Senate seats. And so I believe it's 16 members who are like top closely aligned members of Bolsonaro's government are now members of the Senate. So that was very much a focus, because Bolsonaro was clear that it didn't look like he was going to be able to win re-election. So Congress is obviously conservative. Bolsonaro obviously did very well, but the left did not do badly. And there's one thing that's really important to say here, Eric, and this is something that's not understood in the mainstream press, and most people aren't giving this kind of nuanced analysis, because the Workers' Party, in back since the beginning of the car wash and the Lava Jato operation, like, the Workers' Party's name has just been dragged through the mud by the left and the right. And there's no reason for that. In fact, Bolsonaro's own party, the one he's in right now, was one of the parties that most was responsible for corruption in the car wash scandal, even though you don't hear about that at all. Because, when you talk about the car wash operation, it's always the PT that gets their name dragged through the mud. But actually, what's fascinating is the Workers' Party was able to get as many seats in Congress as it had in 2014 before the car wash operation. So in many ways, the Workers' Party is back to where it was before this whole operation tried to just completely destroy the party. That's huge. If you think about like what the last 8 years have been, and the attacks against the Workers' Party and against Lula, the fact that they were able to win as many seats in Congress as they had before and become one of the major voting blocks. I believe they have more than 60 members in Congress right now, is huge. Also, smaller left parties like the PASO and everything also picked up more seats and did fairly well. So it's one of the major voting blocks that's in Congress, and that's really important to keep in mind. Um, Obviously, will Lula have a difficult job in Congress? Yeah, but he always has also. Keep in mind that when he came into power in 2003, it was on, with a coalition of center and center left parties, also battling a conservative government. And, to be honest, he ruled a lot by decree. He was able to pass a lot of his more progressive measures by decree, and other things in Congress was able to get done through politicking and stuff. There's a lot of things he won't be able to get done through Congress. But if you think about what he was able to do in his first two terms of the poverty alleviation programs, And of course, all of like the international foreign policy adjustments and the measures and everything else. It was huge. And so we consider something, we can see something very, very similar in that same sense. Of course, Bolsonaro is leaving this moment strengthened, right? Because he also did very well in this election, very close, and his supporters will be adamant, and they'll be like Trump supporters. They'll be adamant against Lula, and at the same time, we also have the dynamic of the fake news on the disinformation, which look, it was huge, huge in this election. Like I was speaking with many different journalists and media professors, and they all said, "Look, we have never seen anything like this in Brazil. It's very possible we've never seen anything like this on the planet. Much worse than the Trump administration. The level of attacks, constant attacks, and just to give you a sense, um, Eric, about what that level of disinformation and fake news look like. Just a couple days ago, there were these fake reports that Supreme Court Justice Alexandre Moraes, who was the head of the Electoral Council, he was the one who confirmed the election. He was the one who pushed back on a lot of the fake news stuff. And he's been pushing back. He's opened up investigations into a lot of folks, Bolsonaro people, for their own fake news and for pushing all different sorts of things. They received these reports, these fake news that that someone had ordered his prison, like has ordered him to go to jail, right? And ordered him to step down from Supreme Court. And people turned out in the streets in Porto Alegre. There are these videos that show people crying on the streets and cheering, and this is all completely fake. And there was no like, oh, maybe that's not true, maybe it's not. That's the level of fake news that we see. I joked to somebody else, but it's so true. It's like Orson Welles, War of the Worlds, where it's like it's just like, yeah, I'm buying it hook, line, and sinker, and that's what helped to push Bolsonaro up so much in this election, to keep the race so close, right? And then and the fact that he almost won, and this will remain a key element going forward against Lula, and that's concerning. That and among itself is a huge branch of power that obviously the Bolsonaro and the far right sectors have. But that's kind of the lay of land.
What about, and just to finish up on the political landscape, what about the I don't know, what do we call them? The former center right that used to exist in the pre-Bolsonaro, in those halcyon days when things were more normal and fascism didn't reign all over the world, like
Uh,
what about, the traditional kind of right wing? Has it all just folded under Bolsonaro? Has he consolidated the entire right side of the political spectrum? Is there still an active sort of neoliberal wing within the right, I don't know, Brazilian equivalent of the anti-Trump Republican types? I don't know.
yeah, so this is a really fascinating facet of all this, because if you remember the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, the parliamentary coup against her, Lula's a former chief of staff who won and ran the country from 2010 to 2016. She was impeached in a parliamentary coup in 2016, and that rolled in the PMDB and the PSDB. Now, the PSDB were the staunch enemies of the Workers' Party for decades, and the PMDB was the centrist party that always just kind of rolled with whoever was in power, and that'll be very similar with the centrist parties in power right now. Um, well, they came to power, and then with all of that, they just ran the country into the ground. They handed, they opened up pre-sal over to foreign interest. Pre-sal was these offshore foreign oil reserves into foreign interest. They started privatizing everything. They basically, gave the U.S. the green light to tell them what they needed to do. Uh, and they ran the country into the ground, also through corruption and everything else. And then from that, 2 years later, Bolsonaro rose and came to power because Lula was then jailed, right? And what Bolsonaro's rise to power did was it just tanked those more centrist, right wing, center right parties. Like they just were disintegrated. Now they've come back a little bit, but what's been fascinating is the readjustment of forces, in that the PMDB and the PSDB, which used to be, like I said, Gerald Alckmin used to be the enemy of Lula, they've kind of come into coalition with the Lula government. They've kind of become an amalgam of like the center. And then you have members of the PSDB who joined more of these far right parties and became more under Bolsonaro's camp. And of course, there's this is more nuanced because there's tons of different parties, and Bolsonaro switched parties in the middle of his government, and some of his former parties are still in power, and some of it's like his former party won some seats, and his new party won more seats. So it's complicated. But if you just look at it like those center right parties that kind of really took a hit from the ridiculousness of their coup and from the rise of Bolsonaro have in many ways kind of disintegrated into they're still there, but they disintegrated into either part of the Lula coalition or part of the Bolsonaro coalition. And they themselves, in fact, for instance, this was a fascinating thing is Simone Tebet, who was not expected to do very well. She was a third party candidate, I believe, with the PSDB party. She won 3% of the vote, which was the highest, or just over 3%, was the highest number of votes after Bolsonaro. So the person who did the third best. And she very clearly jumped on board with Lula, and she has been adamant, super vocal supporter of Lula and adamant against Bolsonaro. In fact, one of the things that she was really railing against throughout this whole campaign was Bolsonaro's secret budget. She said that in an interview that this is very possibly the largest corruption scandal on planet Earth right now. And very few people have been talking about it. But she became a really important member of Lula's campaign. So it's this readjustment of the political sphere in Brazil in a different way than you might have or that you had in like in the United States with like the Republicans and the Democrats, and then Trump comes in and then it shifts things because you still have these different parties and it's still a multi-party system, but the direction these parties have taken or the campaigns that they've picked up or their decisions or their slogans, the way they've been talking about it, have shifted very, very, very drastically. And to have somebody like Geraldo Alckmin to join forces with Lula, who previously were on completely different, sides of the spectrum and are much more aligned in the idea of democracy, right? Much more aligned in the idea of, how do we go forward, but roll back kind of the fascist tendencies and the fascist undoing of our country that Bolsonaro has rolled out over the last 4 years, right?
There's an obvious question embedded in the I mean, the very existence of Lula's sort of political resurrection here, and that is that the timing of all of this could potentially be uh, his downfall, right? I mean, he is going to inherit a global economic downturn, one in which inflation is ravaging pretty much every developed economy, including Brazil, one in which he is undoubtedly going to be saddled unfairly, I would add, saddled with sort of the burden of having to explain why everyone feels like they're getting poorer, why everything is getting worse economically and so forth, right? And so like this isn't the early 2000s. This isn't sort of the commodity boom period where economically speaking you could get away with a lot of those programs and other things without as much political, anyway, you get what I'm saying. So how does Lula deal with just the political and economic circumstances that he's inheriting both in Brazil and even globally? I mean, Lula's not responsible for the war in Ukraine, but obviously effects of the war in Ukraine and other things are going to impact his ability to govern. So, can you speak to that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first off, 2002, it's fascinating going back and reading some of the stuff written in 2002 in the lead up to Lula's government, because they were saying this, many of these, I mean, obviously we didn't have the war in Ukraine. The inflation wasn't, rising like we hadn't seen in decades in Brazil. But if you go back, it reads almost exactly like it's like a parallel for now. They're like, oh, the economy's not great. How is Lula going to do this? He's going to have to join, like, so, so look, it wasn't that great a situation back in the early 2000s either. And of course, these are challenges he's going to face. But the thing is this is Lula. And I say that people in Brazil might understand what that means. This is the great negotiator. This is the guy who wants to lift all boats as best as possible, who lifted millions of people out of poverty with his poverty alleviation programs, while he was also helping, big business to grow and financial capital to do well too. Now, you mentioned the commodities, and obviously that's real, but Brazilian state businesses and corporations are also huge and grew, and that's one of the things that Bolsonaro has been trying to undo and to privatize, and that's a strengthening of those areas I think that Lula is going to try and depend much more on than before. Lula's also facing, don't forget, there was the the year after Dilma was ousted, Congress passed a 20-year spending freeze. Um, this was under the Temer governments that were totally pushing neoliberal policies and shock doctrine, and that'll also be an impediment to his ability to do some things. But this is what he's really good at, and I think it's interesting to look at the markets now. Lula, and this is fascinating because the big fake news story that was told time and again, I mean, hammered. I can't tell you, Eric, how many people I spoke with this electoral season who said, well, if Lula comes in, he's going to steal my private property and he's going to implement socialism and the economy is going to tank. Yada yada, yada. It's the same thing. The real is going to tank against the dollar, and the minute he won, the real actually spiked against the dollar like we haven't seen in a very long time. So this is because there is a very clear interest in the markets understand that what Lula means is stability. What he brings to Brazil is the ability to offer some sort of semblance of like of a democratic structural country, and he gives confidence to international investors in a way that Bolsonaro does not. Remember, this is the guy that like he built BRICS. He was the one who did the Iran nuclear deal. This is like the guy the Obama called Okada the man. So he's going to face complications, but there's a reason why Brazil's business sector was also willing to be completely on board with the Lula government. In fact, actually wrote a letter to democracy, which they published back in July or August, in which they say that we want democratic rule. We don't want fraudulent or coup scenarios. We want democracy, and that they're more than willing to get behind Bolsonaro. Maybe not the small businessmen. We saw one of the most concerning things about this election. Small businessmen, yes, but there's obviously a lot of businessmen that like Bolsonaro, particularly those involved in the agribusiness. They like the fact that Bolsonaro is more than willing to open up the Amazon, and they can get their hands in areas that they haven't before, and just completely get rid of uh, environmental fines and whatever else. But and one of the major things that we saw in this election, which was really concerning, and people didn't talk about this a lot, but I wrote a piece for Truth Out on this, that we had more than 1,000 denunciations against business owners trying to coerce their employees to vote for Bolsonaro, which is 5 times higher than what we had 4 years ago in the last elections. So obviously, there's many people that are staunchly on board with Bolsonaro, but regardless, look, people want a solid economy and they want things to roll. And even the United States, Biden recognized Lula's election within an hour. It was very, very fast, and he's already spoken with Lula, and that means a lot for Brazil. The whole Senate, saying that they wanted democratic situation. They would not be down with the coup scenarios, and if there was a coup, then they were going to cut military funding to Brazil. That meant a lot, not just to Bolsonaro, but to the Brazilian military. So yeah, those are questions, those are concerns. We're going to see how this all rolls out. It's not a good economy, but if anyone has the ability to be able to play all sorts of both sides and to be able to really bring people into his government and to really do the best that one can possibly do in this scenario, it it is the president-elect Lula.
Let's take a quick break. On the other side of the break, I want to talk a little bit more about some of these issues and touch on. You already mentioned the Amazon. I did want to talk a little bit more about that, about some of these ranching interests, some of the class forces at play here and what it means in the future. Obviously, we have to talk about the Trump network, Bannon, the rest of them, the role that they play, because it's such an outsized role in Brazil. So, those issues, other things we'll discuss with Mike Fox. You are listening to Counterpunch Radio. We will be right back.
Their brains in, 'cause they ain't got nothing in 'em. We gonna smash their brains in, 'cause they ain't got nothing in 'em. Some of them say them a nigga hater, and some of them say them a black beater, and some of them say them a black star bar, and some of them say them a Rasha. Fascists on the top, no bother worry about that. Fascists on the top, we will fight them back. Fascists on the top, then we counter attack. Fascists on the top, then we drive them back. Smash their brains in, 'cause they ain't got nothing in 'em. We gonna smash their brains in, 'cause they ain't got nothing in 'em. Fascists on the top, no bother worry about that. Fascists on the top, we will fight them back. Fascists on the top, we will counter attack. Fascists on the top, we will drive them back. Smash their brains in, 'cause they ain't got nothing in 'em. We gonna smash their brains in, 'cause they ain't got nothing in 'em. Some of them say them a nigga hater, and some of them say them a black beater, and some of them say them a black star bar, and some of them say them a Paki Basha. Fascists on the top, no bother worry about that. Fascists on the top.
And we are back chatting with Mike Fox again. The Twitter at mfox_US. Most importantly, the podcast Brazil on Fire. Go get it wherever you get your podcasts. Mike is one of the best. I've been talking to him for years now, and I mean, what can you say? Brazil's one of the most important countries to understand because it is not only such a large country, so significant in Latin America, but also because of the connections internationally. As I mentioned before the break, Trump, the Trump network, Trump's people figure so centrally in what's going on in Brazil. So let's talk about that for a moment. When Bolsonaro first came to power, actually, you and I probably should just dig up the old episodes. You were like on this show talking about it at the time, how Bolsonaro was propelled into office the first time through this WhatsApp disinformation networks, through all of these different, at the time, sort of new platforms for disinformation. Now, since then, it's kind of the playbook is somewhat well understood. So, what about this election? Did they do something new? What did Bannon How did Bannon figure into this, and how did the disinformation play? Was it as successful as it was the last time where more or less Bolsonaro won because of it?
So this was, and I mentioned this before, this was the election in Brazil and very possibly in the Western Hemisphere. No one had ever seen anything like this before in terms of fake news and disinformation. It was massive. It was huge. The attacks were constant, and and they absolutely played a devastating and very powerful role. I mean, like I said, particularly amongst Bolsonaro supporters. Uh, and also, and we're able to bring other people into their side. So it came on several fronts. A, trying to tie Lula to the corrupt or corruption or to criminals, like just nailing this time and time again. there was massive fake news, in which even right-wing media outlets just constantly called Lula, the instead of calling him Lula, they would call him, the criminal, or Bolsonaro would just consistently pull out like, oh, the former convict, that was just like a constant thing you heard. And that really swayed a lot of people. I mean, a lot of people that I met would say, oh, Lula, look, you know, yeah, they say he was, they say his charges were tossed out, but they were just like put on pause, and actually he'll, like they didn't understand the intricacies of what went down, and that's because of this fake news stuff. Now there were several modalities that were extremely different between this year and what we saw 4 years ago. The first thing is there was pushback from the Lula camp like we hadn't seen before. So right around the first what do you call it? Right around the first round of the election, you had several things that rolled out. One of them showed Bolsonaro uh, asking for or campaigning in a Masonic lodge. And of course, for the religious, for the evangelicals, that's an issue because that's seen as part of like the New World Order. And what is he doing in a Masonic lodge? And then you heard him talking about, there was another video that was pushed out that showed him saying that he would eat human flesh, which is just random, but that was pushed out there. And then there was this whole question of him flirting with 14-year-old girls, or talking about how he had a spark with these 14-year-old Venezuelan girls who were hookers, which they weren't, but like, so that just sparked this whole thing of him being a pedophile, or was he a pedophile? And that just kind of hitting his moral, his family values, his church going kind of thing hard, and put him on the defensive more than anything else. And this was profound because the Lula camp hadn't really done well with pushing out on the attack ever before, not definitely not in 2018. And the other thing that was fascinating is this was not fake news that they were pushing out. What they did was they dug up videos of Bolsonaro himself saying things or doing things, which then they shared those videos online widely, and they sparked conversations around the country, and then made Lula have to actually respond to those, because some of those, like the whole pedophile thing, went on for days and days and days. So that was really important because it put him on the defensive like he hadn't been on before, um, and and it was done in a way that was not just the left fighting with fake news in the same way that the right was fighting, right? So that was profound. The other thing that was a game changer was the Supreme Electoral Court. Back in 2018, they themselves said, "Look, we didn't know how to respond to the fake news. We didn't know what to do, and so we couldn't do almost anything. Their hands were tied pretty much, and they came into this election very clear about what they would have to do. In fact, Alexandre de Moraes, who became the head of the Supreme Electoral Court, the spokesperson for it, was also the man in charge with the fake news investigations, uh, and with the kind of the fake news, Bolsonaro's fake news machine from the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court, the Supreme Electoral Court, they kind of go back and forth, members between the two. And so you had Alexandre de Moraes, who already had this whole history of battling fake news and the fake news machine, who then was the head of the Supreme Electoral Court overseeing these elections. Of course, that's why Bolsonaro's people don't like him at all. And so, but he was able to really push back very fast. At one point, he said, okay, what we find as fake news needs to be pulled offline within 24 hours. And then a week and a half before the election, he pushed that down to 2 hours, saying that, social media outlets had to tackle these things very, very quickly. He outlawed and forbade right-wing outlets, Bolsonaro-lined outlets, from saying the words, from calling Lula a thief and whatever else. And in fact, they came out saying, "Oh, this is censorship. You can't do that." So that type of very fast response to fake news was really, really key. And at one point, he actually even gave. So in Brazil, the Brazilian elections, candidates get a certain percentage of time during an afternoon or during a day to put their ads up, right? And usually it's either equal or adjusted to the amount of votes that you got previously, right? And at one point, Lula was given all of these rights to respond. So all of these 30-second spots to go in after the Bolsonaro spots, because of the fact that Bolsonaro's spots were seen as fake news. So all of this was extremely important. We did not see this before. Nevertheless, Bolsonaro's attack job was still profound, and you can, I mean, you could see it talking with any any Bolsonaro supporter in the streets, like I've been doing for weeks, and the amount of things that they believe devoutly, um, and that's why they've been in the streets these last couple of days, actually believing that the military is going to stand up and and take Lula out of power, which is just or block his ascendancy to power. But it is something that is extremely important. It's important also because it was done over the messaging applications. Remember, in Brazil, a lot of what happened, this was back in 2018, was that the fake news was pushed over WhatsApp. And in this year, it was pushed over WhatsApp and also Telegram. And this is important because there's no real way to moderate that content. The messaging applications and those companies did their best, and they implemented some means of moderating, like decreasing the amount of people that can be involved in groups and stuff like that. And particularly WhatsApp did some of that. But still, once that fake news is out there, it's really hard to moderate it because the groups are secret. The whole idea is that it's end-to-end encryption, and so that still is just huge because Bolsonaro, he holds on to such a profound power amongst and has so many groups and so many supporters that are involved, and his people are there in so many ways. So a lot of the fake news is pushed out these groups because there's just no way to manage the content there.
And again, there's so many elements of what you're saying that are just obviously, send a shiver down all of our American spines when you talk about, charges of pedophilia and, the ringings of QAnon, freaks, in our ears and so forth. And so again, I guess I'm returning to the same question in a sense. Walk us through, especially for our, largely American audience here. Walk us through how many of these commonalities exist between what we see on the Trumpian sort of right here in the United States and what the Bolsonaro right is. I mean, it's more than just an evangelical movement, although that's a big part of it. What else is the Bolsonaro movement, and just how similar is it to the Trump movement? And then I guess the other part of this question is, I mean, Trump's people are literally Bolsonaro's people. So I mean, we're not talking about like some kind of, affinity here. These people work together. Bolsonaro's a creation of Bannon, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. he The connections run really deep. The parallels between the two absolutely profound. Trump's election opened the door for Bolsonaro's election. Bolsonaro would not have been elected without Trump coming into power. Bannon met and befriended Eduardo Bolsonaro early on before the 2018 election. We know that he said that he would help to work on their campaign, although we don't know to what extent. Eduardo is Bannon's. He's the head of Bannon's, movement in the region, right? That right wing movement that he has, the Latin American head at least, and they've had deep ties. And remember, going back to just last year, Bannon was talking about how Brazil was the most important election that people should be watching, um, and telling people they had to be watching this, and that it would be stolen because the machines, people had to get their eye on it. And what we saw just the day after the first round vote, Bannon was talking about fraud, even though no one else was talking about it. Bannon was talking about it, and then again after this vote, that Bannon's been spewing the same thing. And of course, the connections between Trump and Bolsonaro are deep. I mean, Bolsonaro just completely idolizes Trump. He always has. He traveled to the U.S. 4 times over 2 years to meet with Trump, and in fact, during one of those visits, he became the first Brazilian president to ever visit the CIA. I believe he actually visited the CIA with former Judge Sergio Moro, who was then his justice minister, which is just terrifying. He visited the CIA, in fact, before he even visited the Brazilian Secret Service. And and if you look at like the campaign strategies, Trump's taking a long time to admit defeat was very similar to what we saw with Bolsonaro. If you look to the rollout of the attempts to use kind of a fraud campaign or to whip his people up, into a fervor, which is, look, this is the fascist playbook, right? That's what this is all about. It's building a movement with one charismatic leader using hate, fake news, and lies focused against a specific group of people to lift that person into power and to build this mass movement from the far right. And that's what they've been able to implement, obviously, in the United States, where you still have Trump supporters that believe that Trump is still the president and Biden's still the election. And that's what you have in Brazil. And you will have, and these people will believe that the election was stolen. Absolutely. And look, Bolsonaro's been talking about fraud for 4 years. And that's how come this isn't just something out of the blue. And it's very clear that they've been in contact with Bannon. They've met at the Brazilian embassy when Bolsonaro and others were in town. Eduardo Bolsonaro was in Washington on January 6th, right? So these we don't know what he was doing, but we can imagine. And close allies, far right supposed journalists and close allies of Bolsonaro have been in Brazil too. Um, so these connections run terribly deep. And it is really important to understand what Brazil means for the United States and for the far right in that sense. Because obviously, with the focus and the goal of building kind of a far right movement, Brazil is key. Look, don't forget that Brazil is half the size of South America, incorporating half the GDP and half the population, half the territory. So that means it's the exact same of all the other countries combined. It's massive, and it has a historic root with groups of people, white supremacists, racists, Nazis, neo Nazis, which are completely aligned with the ideas and the ideals of Trump and Bannon in the United States. Uh, when the Confederacy lost the Civil War, you had thousands of former or then Confederate slave owners who traveled and moved to Brazil and set up their new homes in Brazil because slavery was still allowed here for the next, 23, 24 years. And they wanted to have their slaveholding paradise in Brazil if they couldn't have it in the United States. Uh, so, so these connections run really deep, and the connections and the ties between, like you said, the far right, but also the evangelicals run really deep, and that's another really close tie. So the makeup of the forces, of the evangelical root of the people that back is very, very, very similar. The one kind of difference is that you have in Brazil this nostalgia for the dictatorship as well, and this deep connection with the military, um, in a way that is like we don't have with that whole like dictatorship, ideology and the good old days of dictatorship. But it kind of ties into the same thing that Trump, his um, his remembrance of whatever the 1950s must have looked like for white working class America. It's that same motif of this nostalgic good old days. But in Brazil, that's for the dictatorship or for the military rule for many people on the right, right? So, so no, the makeup is very similar, and that's of course why they were pushing so hard. And I think what's been fascinating this last few days of kind of the rollout of Bolsonaro's strategy of trying not of silence after the election, people in the streets, uh, and of continue to push fake news, although they just didn't have the means to do the whole fraud narrative, because in Brazil it's much more complicated because we have world renowned electoral voting systems. We've had electoral voting machines since the late 90s, never had issues of fraud, and the election happens so fast, and it's declared by an overall electoral court that oversees the entire thing on a federal level. So you don't have this like states, you know, dividing in groups and things like that. And literally the results of the election were announced within 3.5 hours, 3 hours of the close of the polls. So very, very fast. And so that helps Brazil. And then you had international countries that then recognize the Lula's victory within an hour or two. You had the United States, France, Germany, Argentina, the EU, who very, very quickly said, okay, this is legitimate. And they wanted to do that fast so that there was no way to open the door for any sort of fraud claims.
So there's so much more to say, but I just want to finish up on Trump before we switch gears in the last couple of minutes that we have. Um, Bolsonaro lost. The calendar tells me it's the end of 2022. 18 months from now is a presidential election in this country, more or less. And there's a not insignificant chance that Trump is reelected here. So the question is obviously Bolsonaro is absolutely convinced that he's coming back, isn't he?
I can't speak for Bolsonaro. I don't want to, but I think that if he thought that this week was do or die, as in I either win or I never return again, uh, he would not probably have given the authorization for his chief of staff to begin transition to to the Lula government. There's no doubt that he's looking at this in the long game, just like he's playing the long game internationally everywhere. Um, and I'm sure that's the word he's getting from Ban and others. Hey, just lay low. It's fine. It's all good. Um, so of course that's playing out, and of course he's want to keep his supporters whipped up, in a fervor throughout the Lula government. And my concern is that they're going to be doing that with their crazy fake news stuff, just making up lies the entire time about what Lula is trying to implement, even though it's just not real. Um, but but I think everybody here can see that scenario of what could happen here in 4 years. But it's also a moment in Brazil right now where this election was so close, and Bolsonaro's election has been so devastating for the country that it's a moment for excitement. Nevertheless, of thinking, well, I don't. People are like, 4 years. I want to be thinking about tomorrow, and I want to be thinking about what 2 months looks like, because I'll be honest. You said you want to talk with the Amazon, and I'll tell you what. Another 4 years of Bolsonaro, if he had won, many people I spoke with, and we saw this in much of the reporting, but it very easily could have been like the final nail in the coffin, right? Of the Amazon, like the amount of the escalation of land invasions, of deforestation, has been rising at increasingly escalating levels. Another year or two of Bolsonaro, and we'd see levels even higher than what we saw, like at the time that Lula came into power, before he cut those deforestation levels. He's unleashed forces like narco traffickers in line in cahoots with, loggers and land grabbers. And I'll tell you something. I went and visited the Caripuna territory, which is this small indigenous community in Rondônia, which is a state that Bolsonaro completely took, in large part because it's been devastated and deforested in recent years, because of, it began under the military dictatorship of trying to transform it into the pasture land, the great grazing pasture land of Brazil. And we visited this territory of 61 members left, and they're just completely surrounded by land grabbers. And 4 years ago, people came in, and what you had was a lot of loggers who would come in trying to log the hardwood. Now nobody cares about the wood. Now it's you go in, you wipe the land clear, you set fire to it. In fact, while I was there, the logs were still smoking. The embers of the logs were still on fire, and then you clear it, and you just cut it up into different you know pieces of land, and then you sell it off to cattle pasture. In fact, there's even a signpost on the Caripuna territory that says lote. It's spelled wrong, but it still says lote, and lote actually means parcel. It's like on their territory, and it's right on the side of the road. And so this type of thing is devastating. It's what indigenous communities are feeling up and down the Amazon. And it's in part why, particularly from an international perspective, this election was absolutely just so important, regardless of what may come later on for Bolsonaro. We'll deal with that later on. But people are like, we got to get him out of there first.
And how did the social movements figure into this campaign and into the movement to bring Lula back here? There was a time when Lula's imprisonment was something of a unifying issue, that brought a lot of people together with a lot of different disparate groups that came together around that. And so I'm wondering, what does Lula now in power mean for the left? What does it mean for the social movements, the homeless movement, the peasants movements, the various other indigenous movements, the various environmental movements, and so forth? The urban groups, the far left. What does it mean for the activists?
Yeah, I mean, this was huge, and like you said, the unifying force, obviously, of his imprisonment, and that has carried on till today. You, the social movements, the landless workers movement, and urban housing movements were extremely important in Lula's campaign. Uh, throughout the campaign until now. They were in the streets. I was with many of them in the lead up to the first and second round. And they were all, the MST was all like all of the folks who were in Sao Paulo were all together on the night of the election. And it was just, super excitement for the possibilities. So everybody is very much on board. I was at a press conference with João Pedro Stedgil, who was one of the founders of the MST, and just before the first round vote. And he said that we need a popular mass movement from below to help to push the Lula government while in power, to help to continue to push pressure from the left perspective. And that's important. It's something that they're very, very aware of and very clear of what is needed. They also help to these different kind of rural and urban movements, the landless workers movement and others, help to found somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 popular grassroots committees in poor barrios around the country during this election, kind of the lead up, with the idea of building these committees that can then do, carry on to be doing this kind of organizing work, not just during the electoral season, continually, whether or not Lula is in power. And so this type of organizing is really important. What we saw in the Lula governments, the first and second Lula governments, was kind of a moment when, because of members of the MST and other popular movements kind of joined those governments institutionally from within, they lost some of their organizing support from the outside. And I think this is something that the different grassroots movements are very clear of, particularly the landless workers movement, because it's the largest grassroots movement in the Americas, social movement in the Americas. So it's something these movements are very aware of going forward, about the need to continue to organize, but also very excited about the potential. I mean, keep in mind that Bolsonaro, the MST was like, this is an enemy for Bolsonaro, and there was no way they were going to win any land reform under his government, neither would Quilombola communities and indigenous communities. And Lula coming back to power means that they could see a return to, actual land reform policies, and that, small farmers could again be acquiring their land and things like that, in ways from the government. So it's an extremely, extremely, extremely hopeful moment for everyone across the left. I mean, and just to put this in perspective, you had Marina Silva, who was Bolsonaro's former environment minister, who had then split. You remember she ran against the Workers' Party back in 2010, 2014. So they were she was at loggerheads with the Workers' Party, and she came back into the coalition, and has actually given Lula a dossier, a report about how to get to deforestation zero. So it is very much a unified movement on the left for Lula's presidency. Of course, once the presidency starts to roll out, there's always complications. There's always realities of the different, points of views and needs. And, that will happen. That's undoubted. But right now, the fact that so many people are back in line, and look, and like I mentioned before, in line with someone like Lula, who is the great statesman. He's the guy, if there's anybody who can like make these agreements amongst all these different groups and is willing to stand beside the social movements at the same time as, in defense of the environment, and stand up for workers' rights more like, like more than anything before. And at the same time, stand beside businessmen and try and bring all these people together in a way that we only really saw in the 2000s. It's Lula. Lula's the only guy that could do that, and still have, a major percentage of the population believe that he can make it happen. And the biggest thing, I'll just say, that he has said, which is his top campaign promise that he's already said that he wants to do, is going to be the most important thing for his government, is of course rolling back out the social programs, lifting millions of people out of poverty, tackling hunger. Remember that Brazil under his government was named zero hunger. It's like they eliminated hunger, and now 33 million Brazilians don't have enough to eat each day. And so again, that's going to be his major campaign promise. And people up in northeastern Brazil, which is the poor section of Brazil, they voted en masse for him, and they're going to back him with all their might.
Mike Fox has been with us today. As always, Mike is, well, he's the man. He's got all the goods on Brazil. I always turn to Mike for everything going on down there. Brazil on Fire is the podcast. Go over to wherever it is you get your podcasts and subscribe to that. It is so good. All of Mike's work is excellent. Follow him on Twitter at mfox_US. Mike, thank you, thank you, thank you, as always, for coming to Counterpunch and talking with us and helping us understand what's going on down there.
Dude, thanks so much for having me. Totally a pleasure.
Always a pleasure chatting with you. Always a pleasure, listeners. Thank you, as always, for all of the support. Go over to Counterpunch, get your subscriptions. We will talk to you next time.